Eddie Martinez sat quietly in the back rows of the bus. At 70 years old, with a cane moving slowly, he was an ordinary retiree. The other passengers didn't even notice him, till the driver had a heart attack and the bus went out of control in Dallas traffic. That's when Eddie stood up and walked to the driver's seat to save the lives of 40 people. Welcome to the Vietnam Stories. Before we begin this powerful tale, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. Dallas Area Rapid Transit's Route 42 was one of the city's busiest routes. Stretching from downtown Dallas to Oak Cliff, this line carried thousands of passengers daily. It was 4:30 p.m. and rush hour traffic had begun. There were nearly 40 passengers on the bus. Students, office workers, elderly people, and families with children. Eddie Martinez sat in the back of the bus in a window seat. He was 70 years old, gray-haired, wearing a brown sweater. An old cane stood beside him. A small bag rested on his knees. He looked just like thousands of retirees, invisible, quiet, indifferent. Everyone on the bus was busy with their own affairs. Young students were listening to music. Office workers were looking at their phones. Elderly women were chatting. No one gave Eddie a second glance. He was quietly watching outside through the window, sometimes closing his eyes to rest. The driver, James Wilson, was an experienced 52-year-old bus driver. He had been doing this job for 20 years and knew Dallas traffic like the back of his hand. He felt a bit tired that day, had been experiencing mild chest pain since morning but hadn't paid much attention to it. As the bus moved along Main Street, Wilson was joking with the passengers. Wilson called out to the passengers, "Those going to Oak Cliff, get ready, we'll be there in 10 minutes. A passenger replied, "Thanks, driver." Wilson smiled. He liked getting along well with passengers. It was the best part of the job. As the bus approached the Commerce Street intersection, traffic intensified. Wilson downshifted and slowed down. An elderly woman sitting next to him was talking with her grandson. The elderly woman asked, "Tommy, how was school today?" Tommy replied, "Good, Grandma. I have math homework." Eddie smiled when he heard this conversation. He had grandchildren too, but couldn't see them often. All his children lived in other cities. Suddenly, Wilson's face changed. He brought his left hand to his chest and began having difficulty breathing. The passenger sitting next to him asked anxiously, "Sir, are you okay?" Wilson couldn't answer. His face turned pale. He began to sweat. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel and the bus slowly began to veer off the road. At that moment, Wilson fainted. His hand came off the steering wheel. His foot remained on the gas pedal. The bus suddenly accelerated and began to swerve left and right. Panic began among the passengers. Maria Santos, sitting in the front with her young son, screamed, "What's happening? Stop the bus!" Tommy began crying, "Mom, I'm scared." Another passenger screamed, "The driver fainted, help!" The bus began zigzagging on Commerce Street. Other cars were honking their horns, trying to dodge left and right. The 40-ton bus was moving uncontrolled on Dallas's busiest street. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, a doctor sitting in the middle rows, immediately stood up. Dr. Hayes shouted, "I'm a doctor. I need to check on the driver." But the bus was swaying so much that it was difficult even to stand. Dr. Hayes lost her balance and fell into a seat. Another passenger yelled, "Someone stop the bus! We're going to crash!" Elderly people were screaming, children were crying, everyone was in panic. The bus was rapidly approaching the Elm Street intersection, and the red light was on. At that moment, Eddie Martinez stood up. He left his cane on the seat and began walking down the aisle, maintaining his balance. Despite the bus swaying, Eddie walked with determined steps toward the driver's seat. A passenger shouted, "Old man, what are you doing? Sit down." Eddie ignored the passengers. When he reached the driver's seat, he gently pulled Wilson from his seat and took his place behind the steering wheel. Maria Santos said in panic, "What is this old man doing? He'll crash too." But Eddie became like a different man the moment he gripped the steering wheel. He was no longer a shaky, elderly retiree, but like an experienced, determined operator. Eddie gently pressed the brake pedal. Instead of stopping suddenly, the bus began to slow down in a controlled manner. Then he skillfully used the steering wheel to pull the bus into the right lane. Eddie announced in a strong voice, "Everyone stay calm. Everything is under control." The passengers looked at Eddie in amazement. How had this old man so easily controlled a 40-ton bus? Eddie pulled the bus to the side of the road and engaged the handbrake. The engine was still running, but the bus was now safe. Eddie called out to Dr. Hayes. "Dr. Hayes, can you check on the driver?" Dr. Hayes looked at Eddie in amazement. "Yes, of course," she replied and rushed to Wilson. Dr. Hayes checked Wilson's pulse. "He's had a heart attack. We need to get him to the hospital immediately," she said. Eddie took an old cell phone from his pocket and called 911. Eddie calmly reported, "911 emergency services. Our bus driver has had a heart attack on Dallas Commerce Street. We need ambulance and police support, Route 42 bus." The 911 operator asked, "An ambulance is being sent. Who are you?" Eddie replied, "I'm one of the passengers. I've moved the bus to a safe place." The 911 operator was surprised. "You drove the bus?" she asked. Eddie answered briefly, "Yes. The situation is stable now." Passengers began gathering around Eddie. Everyone was wondering who he was. Maria Santos asked in amazement, "Sir, how do you know how to drive a bus?" Eddie smiled. He was back to his old, modest self. Eddie said simply, "I'm Eddie Martinez. I'm retired." But the passengers weren't satisfied with this answer. How had this old man so skillfully controlled a 40-ton vehicle? A young student said, "But sir, you drove the bus like you were a professional driver." Eddie looked out the window and answered, "I used to drive heavy vehicles." Ambulance and police sirens were approaching. 5 minutes later, Commerce Street was filled with ambulances and police cars. Paramedics put Wilson on a stretcher and took him to the ambulance. Police Officer Rodriguez got on the bus and checked the situation. Officer Rodriguez asked, "Who stopped the bus?" The passengers pointed to Eddie. Officer Rodriguez approached Eddie. "Sir, I'm Officer Rodriguez. Thank you very much. Can you tell me what happened?" Eddie explained, "The driver had a heart attack. I moved the bus to a safe place, that's all." Officer Rodriguez wondered, "Are you a professional driver?" Eddie said, "No, I'm retired." Officer Rodriguez was surprised. How had this old man so skillfully driven such a large bus? At that moment, memories from 40 years ago flashed before Eddie's eyes. Vietnam, 1970. At the Cambodian border inside an M60A1 Patton tank. 1970, near the Cambodian border. Staff Sergeant Eddie Martinez was in the driver's seat of an M60A1 Patton tank. Next to him were Loader Corporal Mike Thompson and Gunner Sergeant Dave Wilson. They were on a difficult mission, having to penetrate enemy territory. Thompson had warned, "Eddie, there's an enemy position on the left, be careful." Eddie had replied coolly, "I see it, Mike," making an evasive maneuver. He had avoided enemy fire with a 45-degree turn of the M60 tank. Eddie's hands were on the controls, steady and experienced. Wilson had shouted, "RPG coming from the right, move fast." Eddie had shifted the tank left with a sudden maneuver, and the rocket had passed by the tank. He controlled the 50-ton tank as if it were a small car. Thompson had asked admiringly, "Eddie, how do you drive this tank so smoothly?" Eddie had replied, "Habit, Mike. The tank becomes part of you over time." During the mission, there was another tank damaged in an enemy attack. Its crew was wounded and the tank couldn't move. Eddie had said, "We need to rescue them." Wilson had said anxiously, "It's too risky, Eddie. We're under enemy fire." Eddie had replied with determination, "We can't save anyone without taking risks." Eddie had brought the tank next to the damaged tank, and under enemy fire they had taken the wounded crew into their own tank. Then he had gotten both tanks out to the safe zone. Thompson had said, "Eddie, you're a hero." Eddie had replied humbly, "I'm not a hero, I just did my job." Now, 40 years later, Eddie had performed another rescue operation, this time not with an M60 tank, but with a Dallas City bus. Officer Rodriguez noticed Eddie's thoughtful state. "Sir, what are you thinking about?" Eddie replied, "Nothing. just remembering old days. Maria Santos approached Eddie with her child. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you. You saved us." Eddie said, "Don't thank me, ma'am. I just helped." Tommy said excitedly, "Uncle, you're a superhero." Eddie patted Tommy's head. "I'm not a superhero, son. I was just in the right place at the right time," he said with a smile. Dr. Hayes came to Eddie after checking Wilson's condition. "Wilson's condition is serious but stable. It could have been much worse if you hadn't been here," Eddie said. "What matters is that everyone is safe." Officer Rodriguez began taking Eddie's identification information to prepare a report. Officer Rodriguez asked, "Your full name?" Eddie replied, "Eduardo Martinez. You can call me Eddie." Officer Rodriguez continued, "Your profession?" Eddie said, "Retired." Officer Rodriguez wondered, "Retired from where?" Eddie paused for a moment, then he answered calmly, "U.S. Army. I was a tank operator." Officer Rodriguez's eyes widened. "Tank?" he asked in amazement. Eddie explained, "M60 Patton. I served in Vietnam." Officer Rodriguez said understandingly, "Wow, that's why you controlled the bus so easily." Eddie added with a smile, "If you know how to drive a tank, a bus comes easy." When the passengers learned who Eddie was, they began looking at him with different eyes. He was no longer an ordinary retiree, but an experienced veteran standing before them. The young student asked curiously, "Sir, how long were you in Vietnam?" Eddie replied, "2 tours, from 1968 to 1971. Maria said understandingly, "It must have been very difficult." Eddie smiled with memories. "It was hard, but I had good friends. We looked out for each other." Officer Rodriguez said, "Sir, what you did today was very brave. You saved the lives of 40 people." Eddie said, "I wasn't brave. I just did what was necessary. Anyone would have done the same." Officer Rodriguez insisted, "No, sir, not everyone could have done it. You're a special person." 20 minutes later, a replacement bus arrived. As passengers transferred to the new bus, they thanked Eddie one by one. An elderly woman said, "Mr. Eddie, may God bless you." Eddie replied politely, "Thank you, Aunt." Another passenger said, "Sir, you're a real hero." Eddie said, "I'm not a hero, I just helped." When everyone boarded the new bus, Eddie also took his place in the back rows, the same seat again, by the window again. He put his cane beside him and sat quietly. The new driver said, "Sir, I heard your story. Thank you very much." Eddie replied, "You're welcome. You be careful too." The bus headed toward Oak Cliff. Eddie began watching outside through the window again. As if nothing had happened, he was like an ordinary retiree again. But the other passengers on the bus looked at Eddie with different eyes. They now knew he wasn't ordinary. Tommy whispered to his mother, "Mom, Uncle Eddie is a real soldier." Maria replied with a smile, "Yes, son, he's a very special person." Eddie heard these conversations but didn't react. He just smiled and continued his journey. When they reached the Oak Cliff stop, Eddie stood up. He took his cane and slowly got off the bus. The driver called out, "Mr. Eddie, have a good day. Take care of yourself." Eddie replied, "You too. Good work." Eddie began walking from the bus stop toward his home, with slow, measured steps, leaning on his cane, just like thousands of retirees. No one could tell that he had saved 40 people's lives 2 hours earlier. This was exactly how Eddie wanted it. Not drawing attention, staying ordinary. When he got home, he turned on the TV. The local news was covering the incident. The news anchor reported, "In an incident where a bus driver had a heart attack in Dallas, a major disaster was prevented by the intervention of one of the passengers. The identity of the person who safely stopped the bus has not yet been revealed." Eddie turned off the TV. He was glad his name wasn't mentioned. He didn't want fame. Just the peace of having done his duty was enough. That evening, Eddie looked at his old photographs. There were pictures from Vietnam, groups taken with the tank crew, smiling faces of young soldiers. Eddie murmured to himself, "Mike, Dave, I wish I could share this story with you." Mike Thompson and Dave Wilson had lost their lives in Vietnam. Eddie had never forgotten them. The next day, Eddie decided to travel on the same bus route again. He boarded the Route 42 bus and took his place in the back rows. This time there was a different driver. He looked young and inexperienced. The young driver called out, "Good morning, sir." Eddie replied, "Good morning, son." As the bus moved, the young driver looked at Eddie through the mirror. The young driver asked, "Sir, are you the Mr. Eddie who was in yesterday's incident here?" Eddie answered simply, "Yes, I was here." The young driver said excitedly, "Wow, you're my hero. I'm new to being a driver too. I want to be like you." Eddie advised, "I'm not a hero, son. Just be careful. Look after your passengers. That's enough." The young driver said, "Okay, sir. I'll learn a lot from you." Eddie smiled. Maybe his experiences would be useful to others too. During the journey, a few passengers recognized Eddie, but no one bothered him. They just politely nodded in greeting. Eddie responded the same way. When he got off at Oak Cliff, the young driver waved to him. The young driver called out, "Have a good day, Mr. Eddie. See you again tomorrow." Eddie replied, "Good day, son. Be careful." As Eddie walked toward his home, he thought, 40 years ago in Vietnam, he had saved his friends. Yesterday, he had saved 40 passengers. Maybe this was his life's purpose, to help people, to protect them. But he had managed to do this while not drawing attention, staying ordinary. And this was the most important thing for Eddie. Eddie Martinez continued his normal life from that day on. Occasionally, passengers would recognize him and thank him. Eddie would respond politely but wouldn't talk much. Eddie's story was now told on Dallas city buses. New drivers were shown him as an example. But Eddie was unaware of these things. He just continued his daily life, living as an ordinary retiree who was ready to help when needed. Because real heroes are like this. They live quietly, take action when necessary, and then return to their normal lives. Just like Eddie Martinez. So do you have an Eddie in your life? Someone who sits quietly in the back, unnoticed by the world but ready to save lives when the moment demands it? Someone whose ordinary appearance hides extraordinary courage and decades of untold stories? Maybe you've sat next to a hero on the bus without knowing it. Maybe that quiet grandfather in the corner once drove tanks through enemy fire. Maybe that humble retiree with the cane once saved his entire unit in Vietnam. Share their stories in the comments. Tell us about the Eddie Martinez in your neighborhood. The one who never boasts, never seeks attention, but steps up when lives are on the line. If this story moved you, subscribe and share. Because the greatest heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. They wear sweaters and carry canes. They ride in the back of the bus, invisible to most, but watching over all of us. Every Eddie deserves to be remembered. Every quiet act of courage deserves to be honored. And every story like this reminds us that heroes walk among us every day. We just need to look closely enough to see them. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, if you see an elderly man sitting quietly in the back of the bus, remember, you might be in the presence of greatness, you just don't know it yet.